Hi, welcome to the Spring 2022 release, which is going to be vintage years 2021, Chenin Blanc, Roussanne, and Rosé, and lined up in order in between some of those is Chardonnays from year 2020, classic Chardonnay, zero sulfite Chardonnay, and our Amphora skin contact Chardonnay, which is an orange wine. This video will give you a little bit more in-depth information. If you're looking for a shorter version, there is one of those available also. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Vintage year 2021 is the first couple wines, Chenin and Rusan. This vintage year was reasonably warm. Was a pretty ideal growing season in a lot of ways. We always have a growing season that favors one grape, maybe a little bit more than another grape, or brings out certain characteristics of certain grapes or the vintage year based on the weather conditions that we've had. So this is always kind of interesting to see how all this plays out. So for example, the first one getting started is going to be the 2021 Chenin Blanc. This is one of our small blocks. It's only a half acre. It was a trial. We love it, but I'm not necessarily putting in more of it. It can be a challenge in the heat and humidity that we have during ripening conditions to get it to hang as long as you might like to, or as long as it can in drier environments. So we pick it typically at this point. It's coming in right after whatever it is, Labor Day weekend at the beginning of September. So we're picking this early September. Coming out of a warmer year, we tend to see richer volume, richer textures in wines. That shows up in this. A lot of times it's going to subdue some of the more delicate floral or fruit characteristics, both flavor-wise and the aromatics. So we have some play in the vintage year going on. Chenin is relatively consistent though. This is a bright, fresh, crisp, but full and nicely textured Chenin Blanc, completely produced in stainless steel. So I think it's pretty classic to the style and what we're looking for. We're definitely going to see citrus, but the citrus is a bit more of a lean towards a grapefruit character. You might get some peach notes to it, but it is just kind of like a clean, but definitely delicate, bright, fresh white. And very nice. Next one we have is, and we're going across this line up here, is Rusan. So Rusan is one that really likes those warmer vintage years and tends to handle pretty well damper conditions. So it eventually stops pulling water out of the ground and into the fruit, the same as we talk about with Petit Verdot and Tannats. So it does really well with wet soils in the fall. It doesn't tend to rot, so it hangs a good long time. This one held up till the very end of September. So what that's going to do for us is give us much more complex flavor characteristics to it. It's not what we classically describe as like this, that, and the other fruits. We get more into honey characteristics, nut characteristics, maybe butterscotchy type characters, a whole bunch of different things going on, but definitely more advanced characteristics coming out of this vintage year. So that long ripening is really interesting in terms of this wine. This one is not bright, crisp, and fresh. This is low acid. It is much more savory style. Kind of goes back to what most vintage years we've been seeing in the Rusan. So I think it's going to be really pleasant for people that have historically really liked the Rusan as a drier, more savory, lower acid style of white. We still produce it in stainless steel fermentation, then it goes into the neutral oak barrels to age for right about 5 months and bottle it so that it can come out with this release as a younger wine, which younger wine, it is a little bit fresher character, but really ultimately these Rusans are aging white wines. So if you sit on this for another year or two, the complexity just develops, the depth, the richness, the texture does really good with aging. Same thing, it doesn't want to be served too cold, does great with breathing, really develops and evolves in really interesting ways. So really I think kind of an interesting and exciting vintage year for Rusan. So I hope you enjoy that one. Then we're going to take a jump in the Chardonnays. The Chardonnay program is always aged longer. We're typically from picking until release somewhere around 18 months if my math is anywhere close to good. And that is saying that we are releasing right now the 2020 vintage of Chardonnays, and there's 3 of them, and they're fascinating because they are the same fruit picked the same day. They're all clean wine processed, so they're all like all the other wines, still native yeast fermentations, native malolactic, no additives, no fining agents, just showing the characteristics of the grapes as they grow in this climate. But this has 3 different spins on natural winemaking techniques in the cellar, which what shows the differences in them, and I really think this one's interesting. So they're going to be on the flight where you can try them side by side to see these differences, and everybody's going to like a different one of them, and that's perfectly good. I like all 3 of them, just different days and different times. So it's pretty fun. The first one is what I describe as the classic Chardonnay. For us, it is steel fermented again to keep that freshness into it, and then neutral oak aged for about 10 months on what would be called the light lees. So after fermentation in the steel tank, the heaviest sediment kind of drops and sticks to the bottom of the tank. The wine is still very cloudy when we put it into the barrel, but that's called the light lees because the real solids kind of like dropped out of it. That is kind of standard to keep wines like clean and fresh in winemaking. And this is giving us freshness from the steel fermentation. It's giving us more depth, complexity, evolution as we're aging it on the lees and the barrels. So to me, this is kind of classic style for Virginia for a Chardonnay. What we're seeing with the 2020 vintage is that it was a cooler year. The accumulation of heat is monitored over the season by the academics. I don't do it. And they can come out with the end of a season what the accumulated heat units is. So basically how warm it was over the course of the whole growing season, and this was a cool year. When you get a cool year, you get bright, crisp, more acidity, more delicate components come out, more aromatics can tend to come out. But it definitely favors that like brighter side of wines. You're going to see that in this. It's really nice. So I think it's really pleasant Chardonnay to start off with. And then the next 2 are, again, same fruit, same day, different techniques. So the one that I call zero sulfite Chardonnay is technically no sulfite added because all wines from natural yeast fermentation produce some amount of sulfite just as a byproduct of the yeast fermenting. So there's some sulfite in every wine no matter what, but this one has none added. This is really rare, somewhat riskier, more challenging, not for the faint-hearted of winemakers. Really needs to be paid attention to with very focused, precise winemaking. So while I say I'm a minimalist in the cellar, it's really a matter of doing less things, but the things that need to be done at the precise moment in a precise way. And that's what this wine is. So this wine was kept on the skins, crushed and kept on the skins for 4 days of skin contact. So a little bit of that orange winey character extracting into it, but not overly intense. And it's then pressed and starts its fermentation in the barrel, which at this point I scaled it up. So we have 50 cases because it was produced in a puncheon, which is a 500-liter barrel. That's about 2¼ times the size of a regular barrel. So still neutral, but what this does is lets it ferment in that barrel, puncheon, and at the end of fermentation, it does not get moved. So this allows all that heavier sediment, what in winemaking you call the heavy lees, to stay in the barrel, and that is what is acting as the natural antioxidant. With that, we're not adding sulfur dioxide, to preserve the wine in any way. So even though we normally use quite exceptionally low levels of sulfite in our wines, this one has none added at all. So you get a little bit of a different characteristic from the barrel fermentation. So it tends to soften the wine, round it out a little bit. It doesn't have quite the same brightness usually as we would get from a steel fermentation. So that's definitely one influence on this. The other factor that you have coming in there is you have the cloudiness a little bit. It's bottled unfiltered. So you have more of that residual yeasty, what would be called leesy characteristic in the wine. It adds a different layer of complexity to it. Fascinating, interesting. So this is end all true natural wine. So nothing added, nothing taken away, no filtering, no nothing, natural wine. Really cool to see characteristics in that one. The third Chardonnay that we have here on the flight is the Amphora Chardonnay. So this is made as an orange wine. That means it is a white grape fermented on the skins like a red wine. So we have two big things going on here. One is that it fermented 2 full weeks on the skins, just like a red, until it was done fermenting, until it was dry. At that point, it gets pressed, settles overnight in a tank to again get that heaviest sediment out of it, and we went back into the amphora to age it out about an additional 5 months before it gets bottled. So in addition to the skin contact characteristics, we're also seeing the influence of the amphora. So we can get a little bit of a glimpse of what wines in ancient times might have been like, because clay is the most ancient vessel used for winemaking. So I think that's fascinating to see how that plays together. And the skin contact. So truly ancient wines were also often made with skin contact, the oldest wines. So this is really fascinating to see how those skins are going to bring out different flavor characteristics, richness, texture, fullness, depth, some color. Not excessively dark, but definitely some influence coming in from these skins. So personally, I love this. I think it's fascinating. So that really is kind of exploring the intersection between natural wine and ancient wines. To me, that is really kind of intriguing to think about the type of things people might have been able to drink long, long, long times ago. So those, just so that you can identify differences on the wines. Let's see if I can get it close enough. The classic wines all have this tipping cup on the top, just like the Arterra that you see behind me. That's kind of the standard image that we have on the bottles. When we have the zero sulfite Chardonnay, we've got the nice 0 right there on the top, so that you know which one you got. And then we have the Amphora orange wine skin contact Chardonnay, has that lovely Amphora image right there on top. So you know which one you got. Both the zero sulfite and the Amphora, again, are unfiltered, kind of your choice. A lot of times I like to go ahead and take them and rotate them a time or two, and then just leave them stand up for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, because there is some light cloudiness to them, and any heaviest solids that have precipitated, which is typically potassium bitartrate, because they're not cold stabilized, these two being minimally handled. So you can get some of those little white flaky crystals. That's completely natural in wine. It's typically removed through what's called cold stabilization, which in a natural process just means you keep the wine cold for 2 weeks or so, as if it was in a refrigerator. These crystals come out, they stick to the side of the tank, you remove the wine off of that, done. That doesn't happen in these as a minimalist process, so they can have some of those potassium bitartrate crystals in there. Completely harmless. Whenever you see this in wine, it is what's called cream of tartar, if you ever were using that for cooking purposes. Same thing. All right. Last one we're going to go back to is a jump back to 2021 vintage year with the Rosé. I'm personally really excited about this one. This is finally the Rosé I've always wanted to make, and I think the pieces are coming together. It's taken a long time to get here because from my perspective as a winemaker, Rosé has been one of the most challenging wines to figure out how to make well. To start with, we make ours completely different than, I would say, most wineries in conventional or commercial production, in that we don't do what's called a bleed off or a saignée for our reds. So often Rosé is made as a byproduct of red wine winemaking. So a kind of standard red wine technique is that right after crushing your fruit, as soon as it's going into the fermenter, you start pumping out juice. If you remove juice, then you have more skins with less juice remaining. That's going to intensify the red wines. So it's a cellar tactic to make bigger, bolder reds. It has a tendency to concentrate everything, good things, bad things, so you get more astringency, and you get some of those wines that are just kind of like hard to drink, even though they're like super bold and impressive. But it builds in a lot of astringency. We believe in preserving the natural weight and character and balance of all of our wines. We grow good fruit. We don't want to change it in the cellar, so I don't do that. So most wineries would have this juice that was pumped out from their reds as kind of like a light pink, and what are you going to do with it? You can get it to the distiller and make it into a brandy, or you can make it into rosé. So there's a lot of rosé out there based on this process. But that first juice that comes out when you crush a berry, which is a bad term because you're not crushing a berry, it's just popping it open. The first juice that runs free is right underneath the skins. It's got that kind of like bitter, astringent, phenolic character, and you get those rosés that have that like bitey note to them. We don't have that because what we do is we utilize the whole berry, whole fruit, dedicated to the rosé program. So we identify which block of the vineyard we're going to use in that season, bring that fruit in, crush it, soak it on the skins for 24 hours so we get color, we get flavor from that little bit of skin contact to have it become rosé. Otherwise, if you pressed it right away, it's nearly clear. And at that point in time, it's pressed and it ferments out like a white wine. But the key is it's dedicated fruit. The whole berry pulp gets pressed. And that is where that refreshing, balanced, pleasant juice is to make a really refreshing, balanced, pleasant, non-astringent, non-bitey version of rosé. So that's what we do with rosé. All right, that was a lot of background, sorry. But I'm excited about this one because I've always wanted a little bit more of like a bright, crisp, fresh to go along with all of the like depth, rich, flavorful complexity that we get in our rosé. Because we don't have a linear, streamlined, edgy rosé. It's been a big, rich, full, textured, flavorful rosé, but I always wanted a little more bright and fresh. And again, we don't do cellar techniques to fix and correct these things. Nothing that's going to change the character of the wine. So we work with the balance of the fruit and try and identify a block and picking time to facilitate this. Well, I finally landed on a block that I really like. It's at the Seven Oaks vineyard site over there with Mark and Madeline Skinner, who are amazing partners and do an incredible job day-to-day managing and producing the fruit on that site. So thankful for them. And there is one block of Petit Verdot that's all the way separate from the rest of the reds. It's right on the edge of the Chardonnay block, and it kind of hangs out by itself. And being by itself, hanging it really late into the season can present challenges with birds and wildlife and all that kind of stuff. So I've always been hesitant to kind of leave it over there. So we went ahead and picked it in between whites and reds this season to target it for the rosé. And it historically is a block of Petit Verdot that ripens a little bit slower and thus shows like really bright acidity to it. So this was perfect for what I was looking for because we got all those flavorful characteristics in it, but it had this really bright, crisp, refreshing acidity in there. So really excited about this. That's what's coming through in this wine. So we got a little bit more of a purpley color to it, which is cool from a dominant Petit Verdot in this. There is a little bit of Cab Franc in it, but most of what you're picking up really is Petit Verdot characteristic in here. So it does have bright, crisp, fresh. It's all stainless steel produced, has lots of different like nice fruit flavors to it, complexity that we like, flavors that we like. But again, like this kind of hits what I'm looking for and is a block that I think does this somewhat consistently so we can settle in at this point in time to where this is what I'm going to be looking at doing in terms of our rosés. So really nice set of 6 wines coming out right now. In general, they're all kind of small production, so we'll see how long they all last, hopefully long enough for a little while. The Chenin is at 75 cases. The Roussanne is back down to 50 cases. With that later ripening, the fruit dehydrates a little bit, juice yields come down, but complexity goes up, so worth the trade-off there. The split on the 3 Chardonnays, the classic Chardonnay is only about 75 cases because I started peeling off from it into the Zero Sulfite and the Amphora Chardonnay. The Zero Sulfite and Amphora are both at right about 50 cases. And then the Rosé this time is that size block features that we were looking for came in at 120 cases. So really interesting. Hope you all enjoy it and happy springtime.